Hello, and welcome to our presentation on surveillance. In today's day and age, there's plenty of different types of surveillance that people use to collect data on you, and there's even more people that would like to use that data for their own personal gain. Now, as a group, we've decided that there's about three large types of surveillance in today's world that are very prominent in everyone's lives. You have business surveillance, which is mainly what business is using to further its profit lines. You also have political surveillance, which is what politicians use to try to further their campaign and get themselves elected or pass legislation that they think would support them and help them out. And then you also have government surveillance, which is typically the government looking over its people to monitor them, to protect them, or to gain information on a foreign enemy. Now, the first big one we'll be looking at is business surveillance, and this is the one that you come in contact most throughout your day-to-day basis. You see them through customized and targeted ads through companies like Facebook, Google, and Amazon, and they're the ones that are taking your search data and your topics that you share with Facebook and on social media, and they'll sell them to companies for targeted ads. Now, a good example of a company using the data that they've collected to target people is through Target. They actually collected a lot of data on pregnant women and what they were buying. They looked at the trends and started sending coupons to people that they thought were pregnant, that the people that themselves didn't even know they were pregnant, and it turns out they were. There's been a few cases like that, and I think they've stopped that since then. But that's just a good example of what's happening with targeted ads. Facebook and Google were selling information back and forth for targeted ads. Facebook obviously has been big on the political ads and how that possibly swayed the election through Cambridge Analytica, and I'll get into that next. Now, political surveillance is a little more serious than Google recommending you a jacket to wear. Through this, a lot of politicians will try to collect data on people that they might consider swing voters that might go either way, and what they'll do is they'll try to target where you stand and then target ads that would possibly damage their rival politician so that they might look like a better option to do, and that can be done through hit pieces, through commercials and stuff like that, or fake news, and it's really damaging to other people, and it can sway elections. Now, Cambridge Analytica was a really big company during the 2016 presidential election, because what they did was they collected data from Facebook without the user's consent, and they sold those to different groups to create fake news, trying to push for the politicians such as Ted Cruz and now the current president of the United States, Donald Trump. That was a really big part of their campaign, whether they were aware of it or not. But that's just another way that they can use surveillance to sway really big elections like that. In the rating, there's something called computational politics that refers to the computational methods to large data sets derived from online and offline data sources for conducting outreach and persuasion mobilization of services, electing, furthering, or opposing a candidate, policy, or legislation. So that's just essentially saying what Cambridge Analytica did was that they targeted certain people to use for political actions. And there's also a really good piece in the reading that was talking about fear-mongering and how that can affect elections as well. What they'll typically do is that they realize that fear-mongering plays more to conservative people. So what they'll do, like Lyndon B. Johnson did when he was getting reelected, was that he put out an ad called Daisy, and it starred a little girl, a flower, and a nuclear bomb. And that essentially was letting people know that war might be coming, and they might want to vote conservatively. And that played a really big part in him getting reelected, as odd as the ad was. But people are looking at the trends and realizing what works and what doesn't, and they're trying to target people specifically. So again, moving on, we still have one piece to cover, and that's government surveillance, but we'll get into that. But first, our prompt, which was to examine a piece of surveillance technology that you encounter in your day-to-day life, try to learn about the kinds of data that it produces, or what types of data it produces, and what it does with that data, and then how does that surveillance shape your behavior, and how does that change your daily life. So now what we'll do is move into government surveillance.
Government surveillance. The start of modern surveillance by the U.S. government mostly happened in the post-9/11 scare and the subsequent war on terror, which caused an increase in government surveillance amongst fears of more terror attacks. The Patriot Act, created on the 26th of October 2001, and the FISA Amendment Act in 2008 were both 9/11 or post-9/11 legislation, which enabled the government to increase mass surveillance amongst people. Certain law enforcement agencies were given the ability to create mass surveillance programs just to expand the amount of surveillance in order for them to be able to hopefully prevent more attacks of any kind on the U.S. and the U.S. populace. PRISM. PRISM is a tool used by the U.S. National Security Agency, or the NSA, to collect private online data belonging to users of major internet services like Gmail, Facebook, Outlook, and others. However, it's not just an internet thing. It's a large database that collects metadata and content and then sends it, and it searches through and scans all that information, and it's looking for anything that could be regarding to potential terrorist activities, although it has been expanded to also include the activities of certain criminal enterprises such as drug dealers. Metadata is a set of data that describes and gives information about other data. It's pretty much just a set of data that says who you are, like your background, anything that relates to you as a person, whereas content is the actual content of your interactions that they are recording and collecting. So the contents of your emails, search history, social media activity, phone calls, etc. Most of the online services were provided to the NSA by companies like Facebook, Google, Microsoft, Yahoo, AOL, Apple, and many more. Online data for years was collected under two different administrations. In the Bush administration, it was collected under the name Stellar Wind, whereas under Obama, you had Evil Olive and Shell Trumpet. PRISM Part 2, the phone call Boogaloo. As I said earlier, it wasn't just online information that was collected and monitored by PRISM and the NSA. Phone calls were also monitored, and some of them were recorded by the NSA. They also sometimes tapped into live calls, just hoping to get any information regarding terrorist activities. Pretty much every large phone corporation in the US, Sprint, AT&T, Verizon, they all provided this kind of phone data, including records that showed the participants, times, and duration of phone calls, as well as actual recordings of some phone calls. Using that data, the NSA, through PRISM, could locate from where almost any phone call was, just so that they could try and keep track of people, especially those who were acting more suspicious. The intent of PRISM, it wasn't meant as a dystopian kind of big brother surveillance network. It was just supposed to help the US and its people be safe from any kind of terror attacks like those that were perpetrated on 9/11. Overall, it's just supposed to help people and keep everyone safe. The data collected by PRISM, if the data was reasonably believed to contain evidence of a crime that has been, is being, or is about to be committed, it will be kept. This isn't just relating to terrorist activities, any kind of crime, so whether it's something like fraud or even up to murder or a serial killer or something, if there is data about it that PRISM finds, that evidence and data is kept, and so then NSA, CIA, or FBI can either stop a crime from happening, or they can collect evidence of one that has happened. If there's no evidence, you don't do anything bad, then that data is just deleted from the database. The public's knowledge of PRISM, the only reason we really know about PRISM is from the Edward Snowden leak on the 6th of June 2013. Snowden was a former CIA contractor who was working for the NSA at the time. He downloaded over 1 million classified files from the NSA, Department of Defense, and other US, NATO, and allied sources, including the United Kingdom, Australia, France, and Canada. He released large quantities to news agencies in order to spread information on the US government's surveillance of private information. Most of it was about, just them wiretapping people and listening in and recording conversations. He did flee the US and is currently living in asylum in the Russian Federation, which has led some people to believe that he was bribed or somehow swayed by the Russians to release this information in order to try and weaken the US government. However, there's not much evidence pointing to anything along that fact. How PRISM affects the public. Pre-9/11 surveillance in the US, most of pre-9/11 surveillance in the US was performed due to the Cold War. The U.S. intelligence services had been performing kind of covert surveillance operations for decades, although most of it was non-intrusive and tended to be more about political leanings than kind of garnering information on your life to see if you were involved in terrorist activities. It didn't really involve the mass surveillance of the entire public, especially of our own populace, and the largest quantity of it was directed towards other nations' governments, such as the USSR or Communist China. The NSA was created in 1952 by then President Harry S. Truman. Back then, it was mainly used to collect data and survey people, and a lot of celebrities as well, on whether they were communists or not, because this was during the second Red Scare in America, where people thought that communists were infiltrating every aspect of American life. And so the NSA was brought about to kind of watch over and see if there were any threats of communists infiltrating the US to try and bring down our government. Nobody actually knew that the NSA existed for a long time because it was classified. And, that was for a good reason, so that it could continue its operations without people actually noticing that it was going on. Aside from, just watching over celebrities, pre-9/11 surveillance didn't really do much. It was just mainly used to gather data on specific people and certain governments around the world in order to help try and keep the US safe. Post 9/11 surveillance. After 9/11, surveillance and security was increased rapidly, especially in the just 3-4 years directly after the terrorist attacks. Because of the Patriot Act and certain provisions which it gave, U.S. intelligence agencies didn't need a warrant anymore, so they could look into any person's personal information, any part of a person's life, without a warrant, just so that they could try and see if there was any threat there. That is unconstitutional, and that point we will cover later. They, instead of looking for specific people and information regarding specific people, they were looking for large groups of people. So they were looking for people who filled out, a search tag of how to build a bomb from scratch, or if people were sending messages about blowing up Times Square or some other, landmark. That information and those people would be tagged so that they could be further investigated. Post 9/11 surveillance continued. After 9/11, with the increase in security, a lot of it was technically unconstitutional, as I said earlier. The Patriot Act and the provisions given in it allowed them to investigate and go into anyone's lives without any reasonable means or anything. It's just if you said, let's go blow up the mall, and by that you and your buddies meant you were, going to go hang out at the mall and just screw around, you would still be tagged because you said something about blowing up a public place. It did break several things, part of the U.S. Constitution, the Fourth Amendment. The FISA amendments gave an unconstitutional access to online information if they found it suspect. The Fourth Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, part of the Bill of Rights, protects against unreasonable search and seizure without a warrant, and that was violated constantly due to the increased surveillance. In the UN's Universal Declaration of Human Rights, in Article 11, there's the innocent until proven guilty clause, which is mimicked by most governments around the world in certain legislation. It's pretty much stating that everyone is guaranteed a right to a free and fair trial, and they are not to be suspected as guilty until they're proven so. They are innocent until the evidence has been presented and they have been tried and found guilty. That Declaration of Human Rights was also violated countless times because of this increase in surveillance, mostly because if you did say anything suspicious or you did anything suspicious, even if you weren't actually doing anything, then you were by the PRISM system and by the NSA and other security agencies, you were presumed to be guilty and a terrorist until they proved you innocent. If you were doing nothing wrong, there wasn't, you weren't affected at all by any of this increase in security. You didn't even notice it because most people didn't even know about it. There was a slight breach of privacy, as some NSA or FBI guy would look through your search results and see, oh yeah, this idiot was just talking about going out with his friends. He's not planning on planting high explosives in a mall and blowing it up. It did affect and just work as a shadow in the background so that people didn't notice it, and it went on for many years without any real major issues caused by it affecting the American public.
The Patriot Act expires, sorta. As Patrick talked about earlier with the Patriot Act, it's basically a post 9/11 legislature which increased government surveillance, which was a huge effort of prevention, to prevent an act such as 9/11 to ever happen again in the United States. And it expired on June 1st, 2015. So, and then a day after that, the Freedom Act was passed, and it stood as a backronym in 2015 in June 2nd. And it sought to limit the collection of metadata. However, it still allowed for collection of mass amounts of metadata. And the act allowed for rover tapping, which means that if you were tapping a phone and that phone broke in some form and someone else and they got a new phone, that you wouldn't need a warrant to tap that other phone. It would just go in and you could do that. Okay. Advancing technology, talking about computational politics, which was a big focus on this in this article. And I know Aiden and Patrick talked about this a little bit earlier, but there's a quote that we have here, and basically it sums up in summation is they're saying that based off of information that they gathered from your profile, social media, just different data they have, that coders that the information they have from you, that they can correctly estimate your party affiliation with 85% accuracy. And that's without really looking at your voter registration file, financial transactions, membership in like any organizations or anything like that. And that's pretty impressive, as well as they can also is you look at this quote here, given enough data, most profiles end up reducing to specific individuals' date of birth, gender, and zip code positively correlate to nearly 90% of individuals in the United States. It's crazy just based off of what they can tell from the information they have from you that you did not actually give them. But some of it's willing, some of it is not, that you do not realize that people are looking at. Corporations are starting to monitor their employees' private presence online. That's been going on for a while, just making sure that each person is representing the company in the correct way. And it also, certain corporations are actually having in company cars that they're giving their employees, giving them dash cams, so they can always monitor, the employee, make sure that they are always following, are always, just abiding by the standards set by the company. These street cams and drones, they're all over the place. You can see it pretty much going anywhere. It's in China, it's used in China, it's used here, it's used everywhere. And it's said that some data brokers have over 3,000 data points per person. So they could have over 3,000 data points just off you alone. In conclusion, surveillance is a huge part of our lives, whether we see it or not. In the article, they talked about a prison reference where the cameras are there and the prisoners see the cameras. They're very obvious. And they look at it and they wonder, I know I'm being recorded right now, but is someone watching me right now? And it's a difference because they're always going to be recording, but is someone looking at that TV, at the monitor? Are they looking through that camera to see what's going on? And they understand that psychologically, but nowadays what's going on is we don't know that. It's happening behind the dark and we don't know that someone's watching us. but it's actually occurring. Like, people are watching us without us even knowing. And it's like the exact opposite of the prison reference. And it's very interesting because a lot of people don't enjoy that. And it mostly nowadays it's used for stuff that you really, a lot of it is used for stuff that just almost annoys you, almost like receiving you know voter like cards, trying to, like, cards through the mail trying to endorse a president or try to endorse a candidate of some sort, or just like a gym membership, stuff like that, stuff that just like gets on your nerves a little bit. But for the most part, it could be used for good, for catching bad guys and whatnot. We use it to find terrorists along, with a lot of other countries. China monitors their citizens, same with Russia. As far as we don't know if it's going on here. It probably is happening here, but we aren't 100% sure if the government is always watching us. We know that there's corporations that sell our information, but we don't know exactly if we're being watched, like some other countries are doing. Politicians can use surveillance to sway elections, like talked about earlier. Prism, although it was unconstitutional, broke the Fourth Amendment, was working to save lives. Social networking sites are, the article says, power brokers of networked politics, and I would agree with that entirely. They have a lot more power than people understand, and it's very, they like talked about with Twitter and Facebook earlier. They control what ads are being played, they control the trend, and people don't always understand that. Final questions: if surveillance is illegal but acts to save lives, is it worth using? Does the ends justify the means? Is mass rather than individual surveillance effective? What are the effects of unregulated and unsupervised surveillance? Are targeted ads good or bad? How can we protect ourselves from big corporations attempting to gather information? We talked a lot about this throughout the presentation, but it's just some food for thought, and some stuff to really understand, to really think about when you are going about your life and what you're putting on the internet nowadays. These are our references, basically what we used in order to do this presentation. And thank you very much for listening. Hope you enjoyed it. All right, goodbye.